The Miami International Airport hummed with its usual Thursday morning chaos on September 16, 1971. Travelers dragged suitcases across polished floors, children cried in their mothers' arms, and announcement speakers crackled with gate changes and boarding calls. Outside, the Florida sun beat down mercilessly on the tarmac, creating shimmering waves of heat that made the distant control tower appear to ripple like a mirage. Captain Michael Harrington stood at the gate, reviewing his flight plan one final time. At 42 years old, he was considered one of the most reliable pilots in the airline's fleet, with over 15,000 hours of flight time under his belt. His co-pilot, Thomas Reed, a younger man of 28 with sandy blonde hair and an eager disposition, waited beside him, clutching his own clipboard. "Weather looks clear all the way to Dallas," Thomas said, glancing at the meteorological report. "Should be a smooth one." Michael nodded, his experienced eyes scanning the documents. Flight 914 was a routine domestic run, Miami to Dallas, a journey they'd both made dozens of times. The aircraft, a Douglas DC-3, sat waiting on the tarmac, its silver fuselage gleaming in the morning light. Despite being an older model, the plane was well-maintained and perfectly airworthy. In the boarding area, 57 passengers prepared to embark. There was Margaret Sullivan, a schoolteacher from Boston visiting her sister in Dallas, her knitting needles already clicking away as she sat in the uncomfortable airport chairs. Beside her, businessman Robert Chen reviewed contracts in his briefcase, anxious about a meeting scheduled for that afternoon. A young couple, James and Patricia Donovan, held hands tightly. This was their first flight together as newlyweds, heading to start their new life in Texas. Among the passengers was also Dr. Elizabeth Hayes, a physicist returning from a conference in Miami Beach where she'd presented her research on temporal anomalies and theoretical physics. She carried a leather satchel filled with notes and papers, her mind still buzzing with the discussions she'd had with colleagues about the nature of time and space. Little did she know how relevant her research would soon become. Flight 914 to Dallas, now boarding at Gate 7. The announcement echoed through the terminal. The passengers gathered their belongings and formed a line. Stewardess Helen Morrison, immaculate in her navy blue uniform with her hair pinned in a perfect updo, greeted each passenger with a professional smile as they presented their boarding passes. Her colleague Sarah Chen waited inside the aircraft to help passengers find their seats and stow their luggage. As the last passenger boarded, Michael and Thomas completed their pre-flight checks. They walked around the aircraft, inspecting the exterior, checking the fuel levels, testing the control surfaces. Everything was in perfect order. The ground crew gave them the thumbs up, and the two pilots climbed aboard, securing the cockpit door behind them. "Tower, this is Flight 914 requesting clearance for departure." Michael spoke into his radio, his voice calm and professional. "Flight 914, you are cleared for runway 9. Wind is south-southeast at 8 knots. Have a safe flight." The engines roared to life, their propellers spinning faster and faster until they became translucent discs in the air. The DC-3 taxied slowly toward the runway, past other aircraft waiting their turn, past mechanics in coveralls waving from their stations. In the passenger cabin, Helen demonstrated the safety procedures while most passengers ignored her, already absorbed in magazines or conversation. At exactly 9:47 a.m., Flight 914 accelerated down runway 9. The wheels lifted off the ground smoothly, and the aircraft climbed into the cloudless September sky. In the cabin, passengers felt the familiar pressure change in their ears. Patricia Donovan squeezed her husband's hand and looked out the window, watching Miami shrink below them, the coastal waters of the Atlantic sparkling like scattered diamonds. The flight leveled off at its cruising altitude of 10,000 feet. Michael engaged the autopilot and settled back in his seat, while Thomas monitored the instruments. The radio crackled occasionally with communications from other aircraft and air traffic control. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. "Beautiful day for flying," Thomas commented, looking out at the endless blue sky surrounding them. "They're all beautiful when they go this smoothly," Michael replied with a slight smile. In the cabin, Helen and Sarah began their beverage service, pushing a cart down the narrow aisle. The smell of coffee filled the air. Passengers relaxed into their seats, some dozing off, others reading paperbacks or newspapers. Mr. Chen finally put away his contracts and accepted a cup of coffee, deciding the meeting would go well or it wouldn't. There was no use worrying about it at 30,000 feet. Dr. Hayes sat by a window, her papers spread across her lap and the empty seat beside her. She was making notes about a particularly intriguing concept one of her colleagues had mentioned, the theoretical possibility of temporal displacement caused by unusual electromagnetic conditions. It was purely speculative, of course, bordering on science fiction, but the mathematics were fascinating. An hour into the flight, they were somewhere over the Gulf of Mexico, approaching the Florida Panhandle. The sky remained clear, the engines hummed steadily, and the passengers were comfortable. It was, in every respect, a perfectly ordinary flight. Then, at 10:52 a.m., something extraordinary happened. Thomas was the first to notice it. "Mike, are you seeing this?" He tapped the altimeter, thinking it must be malfunctioning. The needle was spinning wildly, unable to settle on a reading. Michael leaned forward, his relaxed posture suddenly alert. Other instruments began behaving erratically. The compass spun in lazy circles. The artificial horizon tilted at impossible angles even though the aircraft felt level. The radio erupted with static so loud that Michael had to tear off his headset. What the hell? Michael grabbed the controls, disengaging the autopilot, but the yoke felt strange in his hands. Not heavy or light, but almost as if it wasn't connected to anything. Outside the cockpit windows, the clear blue sky began to shimmer. At first, it looked like heat distortion, but this was different. The air itself seemed to ripple and fold, creating patterns that hurt to look at directly. Colors that didn't exist in any natural spectrum flickered at the edges of their vision. In the cabin, passengers began to notice something was wrong. The plane wasn't shaking or dropping, but there was a sensation, a feeling like being in an elevator that's moving in a direction you can't quite identify. Several people gripped their armrests. Margaret Sullivan's knitting needles clattered to the floor. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Harrington." Michael's voice came over the intercom, steady despite his confusion. "We're experiencing some unusual instrument readings. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. There's no danger, just a technical issue we're working through." But there was danger, or at least something unprecedented. The shimmer outside intensified until it was like looking through water. The sun appeared to streak across the sky, leaving trails of light. Thomas looked down at his watch and saw the second hand rotating backwards, then forwards, then stopping entirely. Dr. Hayes pressed her face against the window, her scientific mind trying to process what she was seeing. This wasn't possible. The visual distortions, the instrument failures, the sensation of movement in an impossible direction, it all reminded her of the theoretical models she'd been studying. But those were just mathematics, abstract concepts that couldn't exist in reality. "Mike, I can't reach anyone on the radio," Thomas said, his voice tight with controlled fear. "Just static on all frequencies." Michael tried the radio again. "Mayday, Mayday. This is Flight 914. Do you copy?" Nothing but the roar of static. The shimmer reached a crescendo. For one impossibly long moment, everything went white. Not the white of clouds or fog, but a white that seemed to erase the very concept of color. Passengers screamed. The engines made a sound like they were winding down even though the propellers continued to spin. Time itself seemed to pause. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The instrument settled. The compass pointed north again. The altimeter showed 10,000 feet. The radio static faded to silence. Outside the windows, the sky was blue and clear, the sun bright and normal. Michael and Thomas looked at each other, breathing hard. "What the hell was that?" Thomas whispered. Michael didn't answer. He checked all the instruments carefully. Everything read normal. He tried the radio again. "Miami Center. This is Flight 914. Do you copy?" Silence. "Houston Center. This is Flight 914. Do you copy?" More silence. "Dallas Approach. This is Flight 914. Do you copy?" Nothing. Michael frowned. They should be in range of at least one of those facilities. He checked his watch. 11:15 a.m. They'd been in the air for about an hour and a half, which meant they should be approaching the Texas border. He looked down at the landscape below. Something was wrong. The terrain looked different. Where there should have been small towns and rural farmland, he saw cities. Large cities with sprawling suburbs, highways cutting through the landscape like veins. The scale was all wrong. Dallas-Fort Worth was a significant metropolitan area, but what he was seeing below was massive, far larger than it should be. "Thomas, check the navigation." Thomas consulted their maps and instruments. "According to our position, we should be about 50 miles from Dallas. We're on course, on altitude, on schedule. Then where are all those cities coming from?" In the cabin, Helen walked the aisles with a forced smile, reassuring passengers that everything was fine. Most seemed to accept this, though a few remained visibly shaken. Dr. Hayes was still at her window, her mind racing through equations and possibilities. What they'd just experienced shouldn't have been possible, yet it had clearly happened. She needed more data, more observations, but already her scientific instincts were telling her something profound and disturbing. Michael made a decision. We're going to continue to Dallas. Keep trying all frequencies. Someone has to answer eventually. For the next 20 minutes, they flew in eerie silence. Thomas cycled through every frequency on the radio, broadcasting their call sign and position, but received no response. Below them, the landscape continued to look wrong. Too developed, too modern, too big. Then finally a voice crackled through the radio. Unidentified aircraft, this is Dallas-Fort Worth approach control. You are entering controlled airspace without clearance. Identify yourself immediately. Michael felt a flood of relief. Dallas approach, this is National Airlines Flight 914, a DC-3 en route from Miami to Dallas Love Field. We've experienced communications difficulties. Requesting vectors for landing. There was a long pause. When the controller spoke again, his voice was different. Uncertain, almost shocked. Say again your call sign and aircraft type. National Airlines Flight 914, Douglas, DC-3. We departed Miami at 9:47 a.m. local time, destination Dallas. Another pause, longer this time. In the background, Michael could hear other voices, people talking urgently. The controller came back on, his tone professional but strained. Flight 914, squawk 7700 and maintain current heading and altitude. Do not deviate, we are scrambling. We are coordinating your approach. Stand by. Squawk 7700 was the emergency transponder code. Michael entered it into their equipment, though he wasn't sure their old transponder would even be compatible with modern systems. That thought stopped him cold. Why had he thought modern systems? Their equipment was current, wasn't it? Flight 914, be advised you are being intercepted by military aircraft for identification purposes. Do not be alarmed. Maintain your heading and altitude. Intercepted? Thomas said, his voice rising. Why would they? He was cut off by the appearance of 2 fighter jets, one on each wing. But these weren't any fighters Michael recognized. They were sleek, angular, clearly military, but their design was like nothing he'd seen before. They kept pace with the lumbering DC-3 effortlessly, and Michael could see the pilots in their cockpits, visors down, heads turning to look at the vintage aircraft, with what he imagined was disbelief. Flight 914, this is Air Force Flight Leader. Do you require assistance? Are you experiencing an emergency? Negative, Michael replied, trying to keep his voice steady. We had some instrument trouble, but everything seems operational now. We just need to land in Dallas. Copy that, 914. We'll escort you in, follow our vectors. The fighters guided them toward what the controller identified as Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. As they approached, Michael's sense of wrongness intensified. The airport below was enormous, far larger than anything that existed in 1971. Multiple parallel runways stretched across the landscape, with terminals that looked like small cities themselves. The highway system surrounding it was a complex web of elevated roads and interchanges. This isn't right, Michael muttered. This isn't Dallas. Maybe it's a new airport, Thomas suggested weakly. Maybe they built something we didn't know about. But they both knew that was impossible. An airport of this scale would take years to build. They would have heard about it. The controller guided them to a remote runway, away from the main terminals. As they descended, Michael could see emergency vehicles racing toward their intended landing spot, fire trucks, ambulances, and other vehicles he didn't recognize. A crowd seemed to be gathering. The landing was smooth. Michael brought the DC-3 down gently, the wheels chirping as they touched the concrete. He reversed the propellers and applied the brakes, bringing the aircraft to a stop on the taxiway as directed. Flight 914. Shut down your engines and remain in the aircraft. Ground personnel will approach you shortly. Michael and Thomas exchanged glances. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. Through the cockpit windows, they could see dozens of vehicles surrounding them, including military trucks. People in various uniforms were setting up barriers, creating a perimeter around the aircraft. In the cabin, passengers were standing, gathering their belongings, eager to disembark after what had been a stressful flight. Helen tried to get them to remain seated, but the announcement from the cockpit had said they'd landed and people were impatient. A stairway was rolled up to the aircraft door. Men in suits, federal agents by the look of them, climbed the stairs, followed by military personnel and what appeared to be medical staff. Helen opened the door, and the lead agent stepped inside. He was a man in his 50s, with iron gray hair and sharp eyes that took in everything. His suit was impeccably tailored in a style that looked oddly futuristic. Behind him, the other officials filed in, their expressions ranging from curiosity to profound shock. "Ladies and gentlemen," the lead agent said, his voice carrying authority, "I'm Agent Harrison with Homeland Security. I need everyone to remain calm and stay seated. We have some questions before you'll be able to leave the aircraft." "What's this about?" Robert Chen demanded, standing up. "I have a meeting in Dallas. I'm already late." "Sir, please sit down," Agent Harrison said firmly. "I understand this is confusing, but I need everyone's cooperation." Michael emerged from the cockpit, his captain's uniform crisp despite the stress of the flight. "I'm Captain Harrington. What's going on? Why are we being detained?" Agent Harrison looked at him for a long moment, and Michael saw something in his eyes, something like sympathy mixed with disbelief. "Captain, I need you to tell me very clearly. What is today's date?" Michael frowned. "Thursday, September 16th, 1971. A murmur ran through the officials. Several exchanged glances. One of them, a younger man with a tablet in his hands, was typing furiously. "And you departed Miami this morning?" "Yes, at 9:47 a.m. "Why? What's this about?" Agent Harrison took a deep breath. "Captain Harrington, I don't know how to tell you this gently, so I'm just going to say it. Today's date is not September 16th, 1971. He paused, as if gathering courage. "Today is March 8th, 2015. It's been 44 years since your plane took off from Miami. 44 years. The silence in the cabin was absolute. It was as if every person had stopped breathing simultaneously. Then, chaos erupted. Passengers shouted questions, some laughing nervously, thinking it was a joke. Others simply stared in shock. Dr. Hayes gripped the armrests of her seat, her mind racing through the implications. The temporal displacement she'd been studying theoretically. It had actually happened to them. "That's impossible," Michael said. But even as he spoke, he was thinking of the strange cities below them, the futuristic fighter jets, the massive airport. "This is some kind of mistake." Agent Harrison pulled out a smartphone and held it up. The screen displayed the date clearly, March 8th, 2015. He swiped through several news apps, each showing current events that meant nothing to the passengers. "I know this is difficult to process. We have specialists here to help you. Medical personnel, psychologists, government officials. But first, we need to establish some facts. We need to understand what happened to you." Margaret Sullivan had started crying, quietly. James Donovan held his wife Patricia as she trembled. Robert Chen sat down heavily, his meeting suddenly the least important thing in the world. "How is this possible?" Thomas whispered from behind Michael. "How can 44 years have passed?" "We don't know," Agent Harrison admitted. "Your plane was reported missing on September 16th, 1971. Search and rescue looked for weeks. You were declared lost at sea, presumed crashed. 57 passengers and 3 crew members. There's a memorial for you in Miami. Families held funerals. And now you appear on our radar exactly as you were, not a day older." Dr. Hayes stood up on shaking legs. "The temporal anomaly," she said, her voice distant. "In the air. The instruments failing. The visual distortions. We didn't just fly through space, we flew through time." Everyone turned to look at her. She laughed, but it was a broken sound. "I was presenting research on this very possibility 3 days ago. 3 days ago for me. 44 years ago for everyone else. It's actually possible. It actually happened." Agent Harrison nodded slowly. "Dr. Hayes, I recognize your name from the passenger manifest. We're going to need to speak with you extensively. But first, we need to get everyone off this aircraft and into a secure facility. You're all going to need medical examinations, and we need to debrief each of you. There are people who will want to see some of you, family members who have been waiting a very long time." "Waiting?" Mrs. Sullivan asked through her tears. "My sister. Is my sister still?" "We're checking on all family members," Agent Harrison said gently. "We'll have information for you as soon as possible." Over the next hour, the passengers and crew of Flight 914 were carefully escorted off the aircraft and into waiting buses with darkened windows. They were taken to a secure government facility on the edge of the airport, a building that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie with its glass walls and advanced security systems. As Michael descended the aircraft stairs, he looked back at his DC-3. It sat on the tarmac like a museum piece. surrounded by modern equipment and personnel in contemporary uniforms. Behind it, the massive airport stretched to the horizon, aircraft he didn't recognize taxiing on runways, buildings that seemed to touch the sky. 44 years. The thought kept circling in his mind. He was 42 years old. He should be 86. His children, his son would be 52 now. His daughter 50. Did they even remember him? His wife Janet, was she still alive? The thought of her waiting, grieving, living an entire lifetime without him made his chest tighten with pain. As the bus doors closed and they pulled away from the aircraft, Michael watched through the window as more officials arrived, setting up equipment around the DC-3. Scientists, judging by their equipment, they were going to study the plane, try to understand what had happened. Inside the bus, no one spoke. The passengers stared out the windows at a world that had moved on without them, a future they'd never expected to see. The buildings were taller, the cars were different. The very air seemed to hum with technology they didn't understand. Dr. Hayes pressed her forehead against the cool glass, equations running through her mind. She'd spent years studying the theoretical possibility of temporal displacement. Now she was living proof it was possible, but the how and why remained mysteries. What had caused the anomaly? Was it random, or had they passed through some kind of natural phenomenon? Could it happen again? Could they go back? That last thought struck everyone simultaneously, though no one voiced it yet. If they'd traveled forward in time, could they travel backward? Could they return to 1971, to their lives, to their families before they'd aged and changed and possibly died? The bus pulled into an underground garage, and the passengers were led into a building that looked more like a hospital than anything else. Clean white walls, fluorescent lighting, the smell of antiseptic. They were separated into individual rooms, for your privacy and to conduct proper examinations, they were told. Each room comfortable, but clearly secure. Michael sat in his room, still wearing his pilot's uniform, and stared at the television on the wall. The remote control was like nothing he'd ever seen, but after a few minutes of experimentation, he managed to turn it on. The news channels were covering their arrival, the miraculous return of Flight 912, lost for 44 years. His own picture appeared on the screen, a photograph from 1971, and next to it, video footage of him being escorted into the building just minutes ago. He hadn't aged, not even a day. A knock on the door and Dr. Sarah Martinez entered. She was a physician, she explained, specializing in aerospace medicine. She needed to conduct some examinations, take some blood samples, make sure everyone was physically healthy. Michael submitted to the tests numbly, answering questions about how he felt, whether he'd experienced any symptoms during the flight, whether he felt any different now. Physically, you appear to be in perfect health, Dr. Martinez said, reviewing her tablet. Your vitals are normal, your blood work will take a few days, but preliminary results show nothing unusual. It's as if you really did just fly here this morning from 1971. Because we did, Michael said quietly. Yes, she agreed. That's what makes this so extraordinary. Whatever happened to your plane, it appears to have created a perfect temporal stasis. You didn't age, your bodies didn't change. For you, only a few hours have passed. For the rest of us, it's been 44 years. My family, Michael said, looking up at her. Do you know, is my wife? Dr. Martinez's expression softened. We're still gathering information on all family members. Someone from the team will speak with you about that very soon. I know this is difficult, Captain Harrington. What you're going through, what all of you are going through, is unprecedented. We're here to help in any way we can. After she left, Michael lay back on the bed and closed his eyes. Somewhere in this strange future, his family existed or had existed. His children were older than he was. His wife might be an elderly woman, if she was still alive at all. His parents were almost certainly dead. Everyone he'd known, every friend, every colleague had lived entire lives while he was suspended in that impossible moment. Down the hall, in another room, Dr. Elizabeth Hayes was having a very different conversation. The men and women seated around her table weren't doctors. They were scientists, physicists, aerospace engineers. They wanted to understand what had happened from a technical perspective, and they recognized that she might have insights the other passengers didn't. The shimmer, she was saying, gesturing with her hands. It started as something like heat distortion, but it intensified. The colors were wrong, not just unusual, but literally colors that don't exist in the normal visible spectrum. And the sensation, it felt like moving in a direction that doesn't have a name. Temporal displacement, one of the scientists said, a woman with gray-streaked hair and intense eyes. We've theorized about it but never observed it. If what you're describing is accurate, you passed through some kind of temporal anomaly. But what would cause such an anomaly? Dr. Hayes asked. We were over the Gulf of Mexico. Nothing unusual in that location. Clear weather, no storms, no obvious sources of electromagnetic interference. Maybe it wasn't location, another scientist suggested. Maybe it was timing. Maybe conditions aligned in a way that's only possible at certain moments. A convergence of factors we don't fully understand yet. They talked for hours. Dr. Hayes recounting every detail she could remember. The scientists taking notes, asking questions, building hypotheses. It was energizing in a way, losing herself in the scientific puzzle, but eventually exhaustion caught up with her, and they let her return to her room to rest. As night fell on this strange new world, though the concept of night felt surreal when the last night she'd experienced had been 44 years ago, the passengers of Flight 914 lay in their beds, each dealing with their impossible situation in their own way. Some cried, some stared at walls, some tried to sleep and found they couldn't, and some, like Michael Harrington, simply waited for what would come next, knowing that their lives had been irrevocably changed in ways they were only beginning to understand. Tomorrow they would learn more. Tomorrow they would start to face the reality of what had happened, what they'd lost, and what, if anything, they might be able to reclaim. But tonight they existed in a liminal space, caught between the world they'd left and the world they'd arrived in, between the past they remembered and the future they'd unwittingly skipped. And somewhere in the facility, locked in a secure hangar, the DC-3 sat silent under bright lights, surrounded by instruments and sensors, holding whatever secrets might explain the impossible journey it had taken. Scientists would study it for months, years perhaps, looking for answers to questions humanity had never expected to ask. But the plane was just metal and rivets, wires and fuel. The real mystery walked and breathed and tried to sleep in the rooms of the facility. 60 souls who had slipped through time itself, and who would now have to learn to live in a world that had forgotten them, that had mourned them, that had moved on without them. The night stretched on, and in Dallas-Fort Worth the city lights glittered under a sky that looked the same as it had in 1971, even though everything else had changed. Time was supposed to be constant, unidirectional, inexorable, but Flight 914 had proven otherwise, and in doing so it had raised questions that would haunt everyone involved for years to come. What force could tear a hole in time? Could it happen again? And most importantly, could they find a way home? Morning came too quickly and too slowly. Michael had finally fallen into an uneasy sleep around 3 a.m., only to jerk awake at 6 with his heart pounding, momentarily disoriented before the impossible reality came crashing back. March 8, 2015, 44 years in the future. He showered in the small bathroom attached to his room, struck by small differences. The design of the fixtures, the efficiency of the water heater, the way the soap dispensed from a wall-mounted unit. Everything was familiar enough to use but strange enough to remind him constantly that he was out of his time. A breakfast tray had been left outside his door. Scrambled eggs, bacon, toast, orange juice, and coffee. The food tasted the same, at least. He ate mechanically, staring at the television he'd left on all night. The news was still covering their arrival, with endless speculation from experts and non-experts alike. Some called it a miracle. Others suggested elaborate hoaxes. A few mentioned alien abduction, though those claims seemed to be treated as fringe theories even in 2015. Agent Harrison arrived at 8 a.m. sharp, accompanied by a woman he introduced as Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a psychologist specializing in trauma and crisis counseling. They sat across from Michael in the small seating area of his room, their expressions professionally compassionate. "How are you feeling, Captain?" Dr. Walsh asked. Michael laughed, but there was no humor in it. "How am I supposed to feel? I went to bed in 1971 and woke up in 2015. My whole life is gone. I understand this is overwhelming," she said gently. "What you're experiencing is a profound form of temporal displacement. It's grief, but unlike anything we typically encounter. You're mourning the loss of your entire timeline. We're here to help you navigate this," Agent Harrison added. "But we also need your cooperation with our investigation. We need to understand what happened to your plane, and we need to discuss what happens next, for you and the other passengers." Michael set down his coffee cup. "What about my family? Do you know anything yet?" Agent Harrison opened a tablet and consulted it. Michael noticed his hands, the way he manipulated the device with practiced ease, the technology so advanced compared to anything from 1971. Your wife, Janet Harrington, is still alive. She lives in a retirement community in Scottsdale, Arizona. She's 88 years old. The room tilted slightly. Michael gripped the armrest of his chair. Janet, still alive, but 88 years old. He tried to imagine it and couldn't. In his mind, she was still 40, still the woman he'd kissed goodbye that morning before heading to the airport. Your son, Daniel, is 52, Agent Harrison continued. He's a lawyer in Chicago, married with 3 children of his own. Your daughter, Lisa, is 50. She's a teacher in Seattle, also married with 2 children. They've both been notified of your return. They're having difficulty processing it, as you might imagine. They probably don't even remember me, Michael said, his voice hollow. Daniel was 8. Lisa was 6. I'm a stranger to them now. Memories of parents are strong, even childhood ones, Dr. Walsh said. But you're right that the relationship will be complicated. They're older than you now. That's going to be difficult for everyone to navigate. Do they want to see me? They do, Agent Harrison confirmed. But we're recommending a gradual approach. Phone calls first, then video calls, then in-person meetings when everyone is ready. We have specialists who will work with both you and your family members to facilitate this process. Michael nodded numbly. Phone calls, video calls, terms that meant something different now than they had in 1971. What about the other passengers? How are they handling this? Everyone is being evaluated individually, Dr. Walsh said. Some are coping better than others. Mrs. Sullivan learned that her sister passed away in 1998. That was very difficult. Mr. Chen's business partner died in 1989. The Donovans are struggling with the fact that their families gave up looking for them decades ago. And Dr. Hayes? Dr. Hayes is actually doing quite well, all things considered, Agent Harrison said. Her scientific background seems to be helping her process this. She's been working with our research team, trying to understand what happened. Over the next several days, a routine established itself in the facility. Mornings were for medical examinations and psychological evaluations. Afternoons were for debriefings, where various government officials asked endless questions about the flight, the temporal anomaly, what they'd seen and felt and experienced. Evenings were for what the staff called acclimation training, learning about the 44 years they'd missed. It was overwhelming. The fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the First Gulf War, September 11, 2001, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the election of the first black president, the technological revolution, computers, the internet, smartphones, social media. The world had changed so profoundly that it felt like a different planet. Michael spent hours with a young specialist named Kevin, who walked him through the basics of modern technology. The smartphone in his hands felt like magic, all of human knowledge accessible through a glowing screen smaller than a paperback book. He could see real-time video of his children, now middle-aged adults, though they hadn't yet connected directly. He could read news from around the world instantly. He could watch television shows and movies from decades he'd missed. It's too much, he told Dr. Walsh during one of their sessions. How am I supposed to integrate all of this? I feel like Rip Van Winkle. You don't have to integrate it all at once, she assured him. Take it one day at a time. Focus on what's immediately important to you. What was immediately important was understanding what had happened, why his plane had been caught in that temporal anomaly, whether it could happen again, whether there was any possibility, however remote, of returning to 1971. He wasn't the only one thinking along those lines. Dr. Elizabeth Hayes had become something of a leader among the passengers, her scientific expertise giving her a framework for processing the impossible. She'd requested and been granted access to the research team studying the DC-3, and she spent hours in the hangar where the plane was being analyzed. Michael visited her there one afternoon, finding her standing beneath the aircraft's wing, staring up at the old metal skin as if it held answers written in rivets and sealant. Captain Harrington, she greeted him. Come to see our time machine? Is that what it is? In a sense. She gestured to the equipment surrounding the plane, sensors, cameras, electromagnetic scanners. They've been taking readings for days. So far, they haven't found anything unusual. No residual radiation, no exotic particles, no temporal signatures, though I'm not even sure what a temporal signature would look like. From a physical standpoint, this is just a 1971 DC-3 in perfect condition. Then what happened to us wasn't about the plane. I don't think so. I think we flew through something. A natural temporal anomaly. A place where the normal laws of physics broke down temporarily. We were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or the right place at the right time, depending on your perspective. Michael walked around the aircraft, trailing his fingers along the fuselage. He'd flown this plane dozens of times before that day. It had always been reliable, predictable. Now it was famous. The plane that traveled through time. Can we go back? He asked quietly. Dr. Hayes was silent for a long moment. I don't know, she finally said. The honest answer is, I don't know. If we could replicate the conditions that created the anomaly, theoretically yes. But we don't know what those conditions were. We don't know if the anomaly was unique, or if it's something that occurs regularly. We don't even know if the same anomaly would take us back to 1971 or forward to 2059 or sideways to some parallel timeline. But it's possible. In theory, anything is possible. In practice? She shook her head. I wouldn't bet on it, Captain. I think we need to accept that we're here now. This is our reality. That evening, Michael finally worked up the courage to make the phone call Agent Harrison had arranged. He sat in a private room with a counselor present, staring at the smartphone in his hands. On the screen was a video call interface showing a frozen image of a woman, his daughter Lisa. But this wasn't the 6-year-old girl he remembered. This was a middle-aged woman with gray streaking her dark hair, lines around her eyes, the weight of 50 years on her face. He pressed the call button with a trembling finger. After 3 rings, the image came to life. Lisa's face filled the screen, her expression a complicated mixture of emotions. Shock, disbelief, wonder, and grief all at once. Hi, Lisa, Michael said, and his voice cracked. It's your dad. She stared at him through the screen, and tears began streaming down her face. Oh my God, she whispered. Oh my God, it's really you. You look exactly the same, exactly like my memories. You've grown up, he said inanely, because what else could he say? You're beautiful. You look like your mother. Everyone said you were dead, Lisa said, her voice breaking. We had a funeral. We buried an empty casket. Mom mourned you for years. We all did. And now you're back. And you're younger than I am. And I don't know how to process any of this. They talked for an hour, crying and laughing and struggling to bridge a gap that was both 44 years wide and somehow no time at all. Lisa told him about her life, her marriage to a man named Robert, her 2 children, Michael's grandchildren, though the concept felt surreal, her career teaching high school English. She showed him photos, and Michael stared at images of grandchildren he'd never known existed, who were nearly old enough to have children of their own. Danny wants to talk to you too, Lisa said, but he's having a harder time with this. He's angry, I think. Angry that you left, even though it wasn't your fault. Angry that you came back unchanged while we all got old. I understand, Michael said, though his heart ached at the thought of his son's anger. Mom wants to see you, Lisa added, but she's scared. I think she's afraid it will be too much for her heart. She's not young anymore, Dad, she's frail. The thought of Janet, his Janet, as an elderly, frail woman was almost more than Michael could bear. Tell her I want to see her too, whenever she's ready. I'll wait as long as she needs. After the call ended, Michael sat in silence, the counselor giving him space to process. He'd just had a video conversation with his daughter, using technology that would have been science fiction in 1971, and she was old enough to be his mother. The world had inverted itself in ways that made his head spin. Similar conversations were happening throughout the facility. Margaret Sullivan had learned that her sister had died of cancer in 1998, but her niece and nephews were still alive, now in their 60s and 70s. They'd sent her videos and photos, trying to catch her up on decades of family history. Robert Chen discovered that his business had been successfully run by his partner until 1989, then sold to a larger company. His partner's widow still lived in Dallas and had asked to meet him. The Donovans learned that their families had established a memorial fund in their honor, and distant cousins they barely remembered wanted to reconnect. But not all the news was bittersweet. Some passengers had no one left. Thomas Reed, the co-pilot, learned that his entire immediate family was gone. Parents dead, no siblings, never married. He was completely adrift in this new timeline, with no anchors to his past life except the other passengers from Flight 914. They began to gather in the common areas in the evenings, these 60 displaced souls, finding comfort in each other's company. They were the only people who truly understood what each other was going through. the only ones who remembered 1971 as yesterday rather than ancient history. "What do we do?" Margaret Sullivan asked one evening, as a group of them sat around a table in the facility's cafeteria. "We can't stay here forever. But where do we go? How do we live in this world?" "The government is going to help us," Robert Chen said. He'd always been practical, even in impossible circumstances. "They'll provide housing assistance, job training, help with obtaining new identification documents. They're already talking about it." "But how do we explain ourselves?" another passenger asked. "Every job application, every rental agreement, every interaction will require explaining that we time-traveled from 1971. Who's going to believe that? Who's going to hire someone with a 44-year gap in their work history?" "The government is working on cover stories," Agent Harrison said, having joined their conversation. "You'll be able to present yourselves as people who were in witness protection, or who lived off the grid for decades, or who were in long-term medical care. We'll provide documentation to support whatever story works best for each of you. In other words, lie about who we are," Thomas said bitterly. "Pretend we're not the people who survived the impossible." "It's not lying," Agent Harrison said carefully. "It's protecting yourselves. The media attention on this has been intense. When you're released from this facility, reporters will hound you. People will want interviews, book deals, movie rights. Some of you might welcome that attention, but for others, it could be overwhelming. We want to give you options." "Doctor." Hayes had been quiet, listening to the conversation. Now she spoke up. "Have you made any progress on understanding what happened to us? The temporal anomaly?" "Our best scientists are working on it," Agent Harrison said. "But to be honest, Dr. Hayes, we're stumped. Nothing about that flight should have resulted in temporal displacement. We've checked historical weather data, solar activity, seismic activity, anything that might have created unusual conditions. There's nothing obvious. So it could happen again," she said. "To another flight, another group of people. We don't know enough to say, but we're monitoring for any similar anomalies now. If it happens again, we'll be better prepared." "Better prepared to do what?" Michael asked. "You couldn't stop it? You couldn't bring us back? All you can do is watch it happen to someone else." The harsh truth of his words settled over the group. They were anomalies, impossible people in an impossible situation, and even the government, with all its resources and technology, couldn't undo what had been done to them. 3 weeks after their arrival in 2015, the passengers of Flight 9114 began to be released from the facility. Each was provided with a comprehensive package: new identity documents, a stipend to help with initial living expenses, access to job training programs, and ongoing psychological support. Some chose to reunite with their families. Others, like Thomas Reed, who had no family left, opted for government-assisted housing in new cities where they could start fresh. Michael was among the last to leave. He'd finally spoken with his son Daniel on a video call that had been strained and awkward. Daniel was professional, controlled, but Michael could see the resentment beneath the surface. His son was older than him. That fundamental wrongness couldn't be overcome with a single conversation. They'd agreed to take things slowly, to meet in person eventually when both were ready. But his wife Janet had sent word that she wanted to see him. She'd fly to Dallas despite her doctor's concerns, because she needed to see with her own eyes that he was real. They arranged to meet in a private room at the facility, with medical staff nearby just in case. Michael arrived first, dressed in modern clothes that still felt strange on his body. Jeans and a button-down shirt that Kevin had helped him pick out. He paced the room nervously, adjusting his collar, running his hands through his hair, trying to prepare himself for what was about to happen. When the door opened and Janet entered, supported by a younger woman he recognized from photos as Lisa, Michael's breath caught in his throat. She was old. That was the first, unavoidable thought. Her dark hair had gone completely white. Her face was lined with 8 decades of living. She moved slowly, carefully, as if her bones were fragile, but her eyes were the same, still that particular shade of brown, still bright with intelligence and emotion. "Michael," she whispered, and her voice was Janet's voice, older and quieter, but unmistakably hers. He crossed the room in 3 strides, then stopped, suddenly afraid to touch her, afraid she might break. But Janet reached out with trembling hands and placed them on his face, her fingers tracing his features as if confirming he was real. "You haven't aged a day," she said, wonder and sorrow mingling in her voice. "You're exactly as I remember, exactly as you looked that morning when you left for the airport." "Janet, His voice failed him. What could he say? How could he apologize for something that wasn't his fault but had devastated her life anyway? I mourned you, she said, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. I mourned you for years. I raised our children alone. I grew old without you. And now you're here and you're still young and it's not fair. It's not fair to either of us. He pulled her into his arms, gently because she seemed so fragile, and they stood there holding each other as they both cried. Lisa watched from near the door, her own face wet with tears, giving them this moment. They sat together on a couch, Janet's hand clasped in Michael's, and they talked. She told him about the years after his disappearance, the search efforts that had gradually wound down, the memorial service, the slow process of accepting that he was gone. She told him about raising Daniel and Lisa, about the graduations and weddings and grandchildren born. She told him about the life she'd built without him because she'd had no choice. I never remarried, she said. People told me I should, that I was still young, that the children needed a father, but I couldn't. You were my husband. Some part of me never accepted that you were gone. I wish I could have been there, Michael said, knowing how inadequate the words were. I wish I could have helped raise our kids, been there for all those moments. I know, and I wish you could have too. But this is what we have now. Somehow, impossibly, you came back to me. You're here. She squeezed his hand. But Michael, you understand that we can't just pick up where we left off? I'm an old woman. You're still the man I married. But I'm not the woman you remember. My body is tired, I have health problems, I don't have many years left. The brutal honesty of it struck him hard. She was right. They couldn't reclaim what they'd lost. Time had moved forward for her, and backward for him in a sense, and they were out of sync in a way that couldn't be fixed. I just want to be in your life, Michael said. However long that is, however that looks. I want to know you again, even if you're different from the Janet I remember. She smiled, and he could see the young woman he'd loved in that smile, still there beneath the years. Then we'll figure it out together, however much time we have left. They spent the rest of the day together, with Lisa joining them eventually, the three of them trying to build bridges across the chasm of 44 years. It wasn't easy. It would never be easy. But it was something, a starting point, a thread connecting past to present. As Michael watched Janet leave that evening, moving slowly on Lisa's arm, he felt the full weight of what had happened to him. He'd lost 44 years not by living through them, but by skipping over them entirely. He'd lost the chance to age alongside his wife, to raise his children, to become a grandfather naturally. He'd lost friends and family members to death and time. He'd lost the continuity of his own life, but he'd also gained something strange and precious, a second chance, in a world he didn't fully understand. With people he'd loved who had become strangers, he'd need to learn to love again. Over the next weeks, Michael worked with the government counselors to establish his new life. He found an apartment in Dallas, in a complex specifically set aside for the Flight 9 war team passengers who chose to stay in the area. He attended training sessions on modern technology, modern culture, modern employment practices. He applied for jobs, though explaining his situation to potential employers was always awkward despite the cover stories the government provided. He wasn't the only one struggling. The passengers held regular support group meetings, sharing their challenges and small victories. Margaret Sullivan had reconnected with her niece's family and was learning to navigate social media to stay in touch with relatives spread across the country. Robert Chen had taken the government up on its offer of business consulting training and was considering starting a small company. The Donovans had decided to move to a small town in Montana, far from the complexity of modern urban life, to try to build something simple together. Dr. Hayes, meanwhile, had made a different choice. She'd been offered a position at a university research center studying temporal physics and had accepted immediately. If she couldn't go back to 1971, she'd at least try to understand what had happened to them, perhaps prevent it from happening to others, perhaps even find a way to deliberately create controlled temporal travel. It's not impossible, she told Michael during one of their occasional lunches together. We're proof it can happen naturally. The question is whether we can replicate it artificially, safely. Would you go back if you could? Michael asked. She considered the question seriously. I don't know. My life in 1971 is gone. Colleagues have retired or died. My research has been superseded by decades of advancement. But this world, she gestured around the restaurant, at the smartphones on every table, the flat-screen televisions on the walls, the technology integrated into every aspect of daily life. This world is simultaneously fascinating and overwhelming. Some days I think I'd give anything to return to the simplicity of 1971. Other days I'm grateful for the chance to see how humanity has progressed. Michael understood. He felt the same dichotomy. There were moments when the future felt like a gift. Video calls with his grandchildren, learning about historical events he'd missed, accessing vast libraries of information with a device in his pocket. But there were also moments of profound alienation, when the cultural references went over his head, when the technology baffled him, when the sheer pace of modern life felt crushing. He'd started attending therapy sessions twice a week with Dr. Walsh, working through what she called temporal displacement syndrome, a form of PTSD mixed with grief for a lost timeline. Other passengers were dealing with it too, in various ways. Some threw themselves into modern life, determined to adapt and integrate. Others retreated, living as much as possible like it was still 1971, surrounding themselves with vintage items and avoiding modern conveniences. There was no right way to handle being displaced from time itself. 4 months after their arrival in 2015, the media attention finally began to wane. The initial frenzy of interviews and specials and documentary offers faded as the public moved on to other stories. Some passengers had taken the book and movie deals, their stories being adapted for the screen by Hollywood producers who saw commercial potential in the impossible tale. Others, like Michael, had refused all offers, wanting privacy as they navigated their new lives. He'd developed a routine. Mornings at a local coffee shop where he practiced using his laptop and smartphone, afternoons either job hunting or attending training sessions, evenings with family when they were available or with other Flight 911 passengers when they weren't. Slowly, painfully, he was building a life in 2015. His relationship with Janet was complicated but precious. She couldn't travel often due to her health, but they video called every day. He'd flown to Scottsdale twice to visit her, spending long afternoons holding her hand and talking about everything and nothing. Sometimes she forgot he'd been gone, speaking to him as if they were still the young couple from 1971. Other times she was acutely aware of the years between them, apologizing for being old when he was still young. "You'll meet someone else," she told him during one visit. "You're only 42. You have your whole life ahead of you. You shouldn't spend it caring for an old woman." "You're my wife," he'd replied firmly. That doesn't change just because time played a trick on us. But privately, he knew she had a point. Eventually, she would pass away, as people in their 80s inevitably did, and he would still be young with potentially decades of life ahead of him. The thought was both frightening and lonely. 6 months after their arrival, Michael finally secured a job, not as a pilot as his license was hopelessly outdated and he'd need extensive retraining to fly modern aircraft, but as a flight instructor for a small aviation school. The owner was fascinated by his story and willing to work with him as he updated his knowledge. It wasn't the same as commanding a commercial flight, but it gave him a purpose, a reason to wake up each morning. His relationship with his children continued to slowly improve. Daniel had finally agreed to meet in person, and they'd spent an awkward but ultimately positive weekend together in Chicago. Michael had met his daughter-in-law and grandchildren, strange, wonderful young people who called him Grandpa, despite him being younger than their father. Lisa visited more regularly, and they'd fallen into a comfortable rhythm of weekly video calls and monthly in-person meetings. It wasn't the life he'd expected. It wasn't the life he'd had, but slowly, incrementally, it was becoming his life. One evening, as he sat in his apartment watching the sun set over Dallas through his window, his phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Hayes. Even after months in 2015, he still felt a little thrill at the magic of instant communication. "Turn on the news," the message read. "Something you need to see." He grabbed the remote and turned on the television, flipping to a news channel. His blood ran cold at the headline scrolling across the bottom of the screen. "Breaking. Commercial aircraft disappears over Pacific Ocean. Flight 227 vanishes without trace." The news anchor was explaining that a Boeing 777 flying from Los Angeles to Tokyo had disappeared from radar approximately 3 hours ago. Contact had been lost suddenly, with the last transmission from the pilots reporting strange instrument readings and unusual atmospheric conditions. Michael's phone rang. It was Agent Harrison. "Captain Harrington, I'm sure you're watching the news. We don't know yet if this is related to what happened to your flight, but the circumstances are concerning. The descriptions from Flight 227's last transmission match what you reported from your experience. We're activating a task force, and we'd like you and Dr. Hayes to consult. Can you come to the facility tomorrow morning? Of course, Michael said, still staring at the television where they were showing radar tracks of the missing flight's last known position. Do you think they went through the same thing we did? I think that's exactly what happened, Agent Harrison said grimly, which means somewhere in time, 273 passengers and crew have just arrived in a world they don't recognize, and we need to figure out when and where they landed, if we can. After he hung up, Michael sat in the growing darkness of his apartment, thinking about those passengers. Were they experiencing the same confusion and terror he'd felt when his instruments went haywire? Would they emerge in the future, like he had? Or had they gone backward into the past, or to some other point in time entirely? Dr. Hayes had been right all along. The temporal anomaly that had caught Flight 914 wasn't unique. It could happen again. It had happened again. And suddenly, Michael's displacement from 1971 to 2015 wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was the first documented case of a phenomenon that could potentially affect anyone, anywhere, at any time. The implications were staggering. He looked at his reflection in the dark television screen. Still 42 years old, still the man who'd left Miami on a routine flight in 1971, but now something more. He was a witness to the impossible, a survivor of an event that had just repeated itself, and possibly the key to understanding how time itself could fold and twist and trap people in its currents. Tomorrow he would go back to the facility, would share everything he'd experienced, would try to help others trapped in the same impossible situation he'd faced. But tonight, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of his displacement, the grief for what he'd lost and the uncertain hope for what he might still find in this strange new world. Outside his window, the city lights of Dallas-Fort Worth twinkled in the darkness, the same stars above them that had shone in 1971, constants in a universe that had proven itself far stranger and more fluid than anyone had imagined. The facility was a controlled chaos when Michael arrived the next morning. The same white corridors and clean rooms where he'd spent his first weeks in 2015 now buzzed with urgent activity. Scientists rushed between offices with tablets and printouts. Military personnel coordinated with civilian authorities. And in the center of it all, Agent Harrison directed operations with the focused intensity of someone managing a crisis that could reshape humanity's understanding of reality itself. Dr. Hayes was already there, standing in front of a wall of monitors displaying data streams Michael couldn't begin to interpret. She'd changed in the 6 months since their arrival, more confident in this timeline, more comfortable with the technology, her hair cut in a modern style. She was in her element now, surrounded by scientific equipment and theoretical physics. "Captain," she greeted him without looking away from the screens, "Flight 227 disappeared at 14:47 UTC yesterday. That's 6:47 a.m. Pacific time. The last transmission mentioned instrument failures identical to what we experienced. Compass spinning, altimeter malfunctioning, radio interference. Then nothing. They vanished from radar in the same way we did." "Any sign of them?" Michael asked, studying the data displayed on the screens even though most of it was meaningless to him. "That's the problem. We don't know where or when to look. They could have jumped forward like we did, backward or to any point in time." She pulled up a different screen showing a map of the Pacific Ocean with various marked locations. "We've got ships and aircraft searching the area where they disappeared. But if they went through a temporal anomaly, physical searching is useless." Agent Harrison joined them, looking like he hadn't slept. "We need to understand the mechanism. What causes these anomalies? Are they random or is there a pattern? Dr. Hayes, you've been studying this for months. What's your theory?" Dr. Hayes turned away from the monitors, her expression serious. "I think it's a confluence of factors. Atmospheric conditions, electromagnetic fields, possibly solar activity, all aligning in specific ways at specific locations, like a perfect storm, but for space-time instead of weather. The chances of it happening are astronomically low, which is why we only have 2 documented cases in all of human history. That we know of," Michael interjected. "How many other unexplained disappearances might have been temporal displacements? The Bermuda Triangle, lost ships, missing aircraft. Exactly what I've been researching," Dr. Hayes confirmed. "There are dozens of cases throughout history that might fit the pattern, but without survivors we can't confirm anything." A young analyst approached with a tablet. "Dr. Hayes, the atmospheric data is in. Conditions at the point of disappearance show unusual electromagnetic readings, very similar to what we've modeled for the Flight 914 incident. Dr. Hayes took the tablet, scrolling through the data rapidly. Her eyes widened. This is it. This is the signature. We can detect it. She looked up at Agent Harrison and Michael with barely contained excitement. If we can detect these conditions, we can predict when and where temporal anomalies might occur. We can warn aircraft, reroute flights, maybe even find Flight 227, Agent Harrison finished. If we know what to look for, we can search through time. Search through time? Michael repeated. How? Dr. Hayes was already pulling up new screens, her fingers flying across keyboards and touchscreens. If we know the signature of a temporal anomaly, we can look for traces of it in the past and project where it might appear in the future. We can't travel through time ourselves, not yet, but we can map where these anomalies have occurred and might occur. Over the next several days, Michael found himself drawn into the investigation in ways he never expected. His first-hand experience with the temporal anomaly made him valuable to the research team, and his aviation background helped him understand the technical aspects of the disappearance. He spent hours reviewing flight data, comparing the telemetry from Flight 227's last moments with his own memories of Flight 914's experience. Other passengers from his flight were brought in as consultants as well. Thomas Reed provided detailed accounts of the instrument failures he'd observed as co-pilot. Dr. Hayes became the de facto scientific lead on the project, her theoretical work suddenly validated by hard data. Even some of the passengers who'd tried to move on from their displacement found themselves drawn back, wanting to help prevent what had happened to them from happening to others. Margaret Sullivan came in to describe the sensation she'd felt in the cabin, that strange feeling of movement in an impossible direction. Robert Chen, who'd been in the business of risk assessment before his displacement, helped develop protocols for what to do if another aircraft reported similar conditions. The Donovans, who'd been trying to build a quiet life in Montana, returned to provide their perspectives on the psychological impact of temporal displacement, helping prepare support systems for the Flight 227 passengers if and when they were found. It's like we're forming a support group, Margaret observed during a break in one of the briefing sessions. Except our shared trauma is being displaced from time itself. The time displaced anonymous, Thomas joked, though there was an edge to his humor. He'd been struggling more than most with adapting to 2015, and Michael worried about him. The work was intense and often frustrating. For every breakthrough, there were a dozen dead ends. For every piece of data that fit their theories, there were anomalies that didn't make sense. But slowly, painstakingly, they built a model of temporal displacement. Hayes presented their findings to a room full of government officials, military brass, and scientists from around the world. Michael sat in the back, watching her command the room with confidence he'd never seen in their first timeline. What we're calling temporal anomalies are essentially tears in spacetime, she explained. Holographic displays showing her models in 3 dimensions. They're caused by extreme convergences of electromagnetic energy, atmospheric conditions, and what we believe are quantum fluctuations at a macroscopic scale. The probability of all these factors aligning is incredibly low. We estimate perhaps one event every few decades globally. But they can be predicted? Asked a general whose uniform was decorated with more ribbons than Michael had ever seen on one person. To a degree. We can identify conditions that might lead to an anomaly forming, and we can detect an anomaly when it's active. What we can't do yet is predict exactly when or where the next one will occur, or what temporal displacement it will cause. What about Flight 227? Asked a State Department official. Can we find them? Dr. Hayes pulled up new displays showing timelines branching in multiple directions. If our models are correct, Flight 227 experienced a temporal displacement. The question is when they emerged. We're working on narrowing down the possibilities, but without more data points, it's like searching for a needle in a haystack the size of human history. That night, Michael returned to his apartment exhausted. His phone showed messages from Janet. She'd been following news coverage of the investigation and wanted to know how he was doing. He called her back and they talked for an hour about everything and nothing, her voice grounding him in a timeline that still sometimes felt surreal. "You're becoming famous again," she said, a note of concern in her elderly voice. "I saw you on the news." Background of the press conference. "I'm just consulting," Michael replied. "Dr. Hayes is the real expert. Still, you be careful, Michael. This attention, this scrutiny, it can't be easy." She was right. The media had rediscovered Flight 914's survivors with the disappearance of Flight 227. Reporters camped outside the facility, trying to get interviews. Conspiracy theorists flooded the internet with wild theories. Some claimed aliens were responsible. Others insisted it was secret government technology. A few suggested they were all elaborate actors in some kind of hoax. "I'll be careful," Michael promised. "How are you doing? How's your heart?" "Oh, you know. Old and tired, like the rest of me, but happy. Talking to you every day knowing you're out there somewhere, even if you're younger than my children. It's strange, but it's wonderful too." After they said goodnight, Michael sat in his living room, looking at the collection of items he'd gathered over the 6 months. Photos of his grandchildren, a tablet that still baffled him half the time, a vintage photo of Janet from 1971 that Lisa had given him, standing next to a recent photo from his last visit to Scottsdale. The same woman, 44 years apart, and he'd loved both versions of her, even though they were so different. His phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Hayes. "Emergency meeting, 6 a.m., possible breakthrough." The next morning, Michael arrived at the facility to find the research team gathered around a new set of displays. "Dr. Foe." Hayes looked like she'd been up all night, but her eyes were bright with excitement. "We found them," she announced without preamble. "Or rather, we found when they are." She pulled up a complex timeline display. "Our analysis of the atmospheric and electromagnetic data from Flight 227's disappearance, combined with our models of temporal displacement, suggests they jumped forward. Not as far as we did, approximately 28 years. They should have emerged in 1999. 1999? Agent Harrison repeated. "But that's in the past. If they emerged in 1999, where are they now? Why haven't we heard about it? That's what we need to find out," Dr. Hayes said. "We're going through records from 1999, looking for any reports of an aircraft appearing mysteriously, any unexplained aviation incidents, anything that might match." The search took 3 days. The team went through aviation records, news archives, military reports, anything that might document the arrival of a 777 in 1999, and finally, they found it. "There," said the young analyst who'd been coordinating the data search. "October 14th, 1999, an aircraft matching Flight 227's description was detected by military radar off the coast of Japan. It was escorted to a U.S. military base in Okinawa. The passengers and crew were, Jesus. They were held there for 3 months of debriefing and evaluation." "Why didn't we know about this?" Michael asked. "It was classified," Agent Harrison said, reading through the reports that were now appearing on screen. "Highly classified. The government didn't know what to do with them. This was 1999. No precedent, no framework for handling temporal displacement. They kept it quiet, called it a national security issue." "What happened to them?" Dr. Hayes asked. "Where are they now?" More searching, more database queries. And then answers began to emerge. The passengers of Flight 227 had been gradually released from military custody in early 2000, given new identities, relocated around the country. Some had integrated successfully into 1999, building new lives. Others had struggled, much as the Flight 914 passengers had struggled. "We need to contact them," Michael said. "They've been dealing with this for 16 years now. They have experience we can learn from, and they deserve to know they're not alone." Over the next weeks, the government quietly reached out to the former passengers of Flight 227. Not all of them wanted to be contacted. Some had worked hard to forget their displacement and move on. But many agreed to meet with the Flight 914 survivors and share their experiences. Michael found himself in a conference room with Captain Sarah Chen, no relation to Robert Chen from his flight, who had been the pilot of Flight 227. She was in her 60s now, or would have been if you counted the years she'd lived since 1971. But like him, she'd been displaced, emerging in 1999 at the same age she'd been when she vanished. "It never gets easier," she told him, her eyes reflecting years of difficult adaptation. 1999 was different from 1971, but not as different as 2015. "We had an easier time of it than you, I think. But still, losing those years, emerging into a world that had moved on without us, it changes you fundamentally. How did you cope? Built a new life, got recertified as a pilot with modern equipment, flew for a small regional airline until I retired a few years ago. Tried to focus on the future instead of dwelling on the past." She paused. "Some of my passengers didn't do as well. We lost 3 to suicide in those first years. The displacement, the isolation, the feeling of being out of time, it was too much for them." Michael felt his chest tighten. Thomas Reed had been struggling. Were there others from his flight on that edge? "We need better support systems," he said. For your passengers, for ours, for anyone this happens to in the future. Agreed. I've been advocating for that for years. Maybe now that there are 2 documented cases, people will take it seriously. They spent hours talking, comparing experiences, sharing coping strategies. Captain Chen introduced Michael to other Flight 227 survivors who'd agreed to participate. There was Dr. James Martinez, a physicist like Dr. Hayes, who'd spent the last 16 years studying temporal mechanics. There was Emily Watson, who'd been a college student in 1971 and had to complete her degree in 1999 with course material that was completely different. There was Robert Harrison, no relation to Agent Harrison, who'd lost his wife to the displacement and had never remarried, carrying his grief forward through 3 decades. The 2 groups of temporal refugees formed an unexpected bond. They understood each other in ways no one else could. They'd all experienced the same impossible phenomenon, all struggled with the same fundamental displacement from their own timelines, all bore the psychological scars of being out of sync with the world. A support network began to form. Regular meetings, shared resources, a hotline for crisis situations. Dr. Hayes and Dr. Martinez collaborated on research, combining their expertise to advance understanding of temporal anomalies. The government, finally taking the issue seriously with 2 documented cases, allocated funding for a permanent research facility and support program. But the biggest breakthrough came 3 months after Flight 227's emergence location was discovered. Dr. Hayes and Dr. Martinez, working with teams of physicists and engineers, announced they'd achieved something remarkable. We can detect temporal anomalies before they fully form, Dr. Hayes explained at a press conference that made headlines around the world. We've developed a network of sensors that can identify the precursor conditions, the electromagnetic signatures, the atmospheric disturbances, the quantum fluctuations. We can give aircraft warning to avoid areas where anomalies might occur. More than that, Dr. Martinez added, we're working on understanding the mechanism well enough to potentially create controlled temporal displacement. Not yet. The technology isn't there. But theoretically, if we can open controlled tiers in spacetime, we might be able to retrieve people who've been displaced. The implications were staggering. If they could control temporal displacement, they might be able to prevent future disappearances. More than that, they might be able to undo past ones. Could we go back? Michael asked Dr. Hayes privately after the press conference. Could you and I and all the others from Flight 914 return to 1971? She was quiet for a long moment. Theoretically, yes. If we can create a controlled anomaly that displaces you backward the exact amount you traveled forward. But Michael, there are complications, paradoxes. If you return to 1971, there will be 2 of you, the you that originally lived that timeline, and the you returning from 2015. The timeline might split or reconcile or something we can't predict. The physics gets complicated, but it's possible. In theory, many things are possible. In practice, she shrugged. We're years away from having that level of control, maybe decades. And even then, I'm not sure it would be wise. You've built a new life here. Janet, your children, your grandchildren, they're all in this timeline now. Would you really want to abandon them to return to a past that, from your current perspective, already happened? Michael didn't have an answer. The question haunted him in the following weeks. If he could return to 1971, would he? He could prevent his family from experiencing decades of grief. He could raise his children, age alongside his wife, but he'd also lose the grandchildren he'd come to know, the relationships he'd built in 2015, the knowledge of how history unfolded. And there was another consideration. If he returned to 1971 knowing what he knew now, how would that change the timeline? Could he change it? Should he? He discussed it with Janet during one of his visits to Scottsdale. She'd grown frailer in recent months, spending most of her time in a comfortable chair by the window of her assisted living apartment, but her mind was still sharp. Would you go back if you could? He asked her. If I could return to 1971 and none of this ever happened? She was quiet for a long time, looking out at the Arizona desert. Part of me says yes, she finally answered. The part that remembers being young, that remembers us being young together, that wants those lost years back. But Michael, if you went back, you wouldn't be the same man. You'd carry memories of 2015, knowledge of the future. You'd be changed. We'd be changed. It wouldn't be the life we had. It would be something different. But you wouldn't have had to grieve me. Our children wouldn't have grown up without a father. No, but they also wouldn't be exactly the people they are now. Every experience shapes us. Danny and Lisa were shaped by your loss, by having to be strong, by learning to persevere. They're good people, Michael. Strong people. Would I trade their strength for having you present? I don't know. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers thin and frail against his. Besides, if you went back to 1971, I wouldn't have this. These months of having you in my life again, even though I'm old and you're not. These phone calls, these visits. The joy of seeing you, talking to you, remembering what we had. If you went back, this timeline would never exist, and I would never have known that you came back to me, even if only for a little while. Michael felt tears on his face. You're dying, he said bluntly. The doctors say maybe a year, maybe less. I know. But Michael, I'm 88 years old. I've lived a full life, a hard life in many ways, but full. I raised 2 beautiful children. I saw them succeed. I met my grandchildren. I had a career I loved. And now, at the end, I have this miracle. My husband returned to me exactly as I remembered him. How many people get that? It's not enough time. It never is. But it's what we have, and I'm grateful for it. 6 months later, Janet passed away peacefully in her sleep. Michael was there, holding her hand as she took her last breath. Lisa and Daniel were there too. And in that moment, the strangeness of their ages didn't matter. They were a family grieving together. The funeral was surreal. Michael stood beside his elderly children at his wife's graveside, listening to a minister talk about a woman who'd lived 88 years, only 44 of which he'd known her for. After the service, his grandchildren, young adults and teenagers who were nearly his age, hugged him and told him stories about their grandmother, stories from decades he hadn't been present for. She never stopped loving you, his grandson Mark told him. Even when we were kids, she'd talk about you. She kept your picture on her nightstand. When we heard you'd come back, she cried for 3 days straight. Happy tears mostly, but also sad ones. She said it was like getting her heart broken and healed at the same time. In the months after Janet's death, Michael threw himself into the temporal displacement project. It gave him purpose, a way to process his grief. He worked with Dr. Hayes and Dr. Martinez on the early warning system they were developing. He consulted with aviation authorities on protocols for what pilots should do if they encountered precursor conditions. He spoke at conferences, sharing his experience, advocating for research and support systems. The work led to breakthroughs. Within 2 years, the early warning system was operational. Sensors deployed around the globe detecting electromagnetic and atmospheric conditions that might lead to temporal anomalies. Several potential displacements were predicted, and aircraft were successfully rerouted. The system wasn't perfect. False alarms were common, and the physics were still not fully understood, but it worked well enough to prevent another Flight 915 or Flight 227 situation. But Michael also made time for life. He grew closer to Daniel and Lisa, their relationship evolving from the awkwardness of those first months into something genuine and meaningful. He learned to be a grandfather to young adults, attending their graduations, offering advice when asked, trying to bridge the gap between his 1971 perspective and their 2015 reality. He dated occasionally. Dr. Walsh had encouraged him to, pointing out that he was still only in his 40s and shouldn't spend his life alone. It was strange, though, being younger than his date's children sometimes, having to explain his temporal displacement on first dates, navigating the complicated emotions of moving on from Janet while still being, chronologically, only a few years removed from their marriage. Thomas Reed struggled more. The co-pilot had no family, no anchors to this timeline. He'd tried to build a new life but found modern society overwhelming. 2 years after their arrival in 2015, he moved to a remote area of Alaska, living off the grid as much as possible, surrounding himself with vintage items from 1971, trying to recreate the world he'd lost. Michael visited him once, finding his old colleague living in a cabin with no internet, no smartphone, no modern conveniences. "This is better," Thomas insisted, showing Michael around his property. "I don't have to deal with all the noise of 2015. Here I can pretend it's still my time. You can't hide from the present forever," Michael said gently. "Watch me," Thomas replied. But there was a sadness in his eyes that worried Michael deeply. Other passengers adapted in various ways. Margaret Sullivan became an advocate for elderly rights, using her unique perspective of having been young one day and discovering 44 years had passed the next to highlight issues facing the aging population. Robert Chen started a successful consulting business, His 1971 business ethics and practices combined with 2015 technology, creating a unique niche. The Donovans found peace in Montana, running a small bed and breakfast that attracted curious tourists who wanted to meet the couple from the famous Flight 9 tour. Dr. Hayes achieved her dreams, becoming a leading expert in temporal physics, publishing papers that revolutionized the field, winning awards and recognition. She and Dr. Martinez from Flight 227 became close collaborators and eventually close friends, their shared experience of displacement creating a bond that went beyond professional respect. 5 years after Flight 914's arrival in 2015, the Temporal Displacement Research Facility held a memorial service. It had been 5 years for the Flight 914 passengers, but 49 years since they'd departed Miami in 1971. They gathered, those who were willing and able to remember what they'd lost and celebrate what they'd gained. Michael stood before the group, now 57 passengers plus the crew, some looking better than others. He'd been asked to speak as the captain, and he'd spent days trying to figure out what to say. 5 years ago, he began, we took off from Miami on what should have been a routine flight to Dallas. Instead, we flew through something impossible, something that shouldn't exist according to everything we knew about physics and reality. We lost 44 years. We lost families, friends, careers, lives. Some of us have adapted to this new timeline. Others are still struggling. All of us bear scars that will never fully heal, but we survived. That's the important thing. We survived an impossible event and we're still here, still living, still trying to make sense of a world we were never supposed to see. Some of us have found new purpose. Some have reconnected with lost family. Some have contributed to understanding what happened to us so it might never happen to anyone else. We're not whole. We may never be whole. Part of us will always exist in 1971, in that moment before the anomaly, when life was normal and the future was predictable. But we're here now, and we have to live in the present, not the past. To those we lost, the family members who passed away in the years we missed, the friends who moved on, the lives we might have lived, we remember you. We honor the timeline that was taken from us, but we also honor the timeline we have now, strange as it is, because we're still here, we're still breathing, we're still human, even if we're humans out of time. The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a memorial, a bronze sculpture outside the research facility, depicting the silhouette of a DC-3 aircraft, with a plaque listing the names of all 60 passengers and crew of Flight 914. Similar memorials existed in Miami and Dallas, but this one felt different, more personal. It acknowledged not just that they'd disappeared, but that they'd returned, that they'd survived. Afterward, at the reception, Michael found himself talking with Captain Sarah Chen from Flight 227. She was older now, the 16 years since her displacement showing in the silver of her hair and the lines around her eyes, aging that Michael himself wasn't experiencing at the same rate. His body's internal clock still thinking it was only 5 years since 1971. Do you think we'll ever understand it? She asked. Really understand what happened to us? Dr. Hayes and Dr. Martinez think we're close to a breakthrough in controlled displacement, Michael said. Maybe in another decade, maybe 2, we'll be able to deliberately travel through time, and maybe then we'll understand the natural anomalies that caught us. Would you go back? If you could? It was the question he'd been asked dozens of times. The question he'd asked himself thousands of times. I don't know anymore, he admitted. At first, absolutely. I wanted nothing more than to return to 1971, to Janet when she was young, to my children before I missed their lives. But now, I have grandchildren I've come to know. I've done work that matters. I've lived 5 years in this timeline. If I went back, all of this would cease to exist. These memories, these relationships, this version of me. Would I really want to erase all that? No easy answers, Sarah said. Never are. That night, Michael returned to his apartment, a better one now as he'd gotten promotions at the flight school and could afford more. He sat by his window looking out at Dallas, at this future city that was slowly becoming his present city, and he thought about the question of return. If someone offered him a portal back to September 16th, 1971, would he take it? The answer surprised him. Probably not. Because despite everything, the loss, the displacement, the fundamental wrongness of being out of his own time, he'd built something here. He'd found meaning in helping prevent others from experiencing what he'd gone through. He'd reconnected with his family, even if the relationships were strange and complicated. He'd learned to navigate a world 44 years more advanced than the one he'd left. He'd grown. Going back would mean erasing all that growth. It would mean the Michael Harrington who'd flown through a temporal anomaly and emerged in the future would never exist. And while the old Michael from 1971 might have been simpler, might have been more comfortable in his own time, this Michael, the one who'd survived the impossible, was perhaps more complete. His phone buzzed with a text from Lisa. "Dad, Mark's graduation next month. You'll be there, right?" He smiled and typed back, "Wouldn't miss it for the world. Any time." 10 years after Flight 912's arrival in 2015, the Temporal Displacement Research Facility achieved the breakthrough Dr. Hayes and Dr. Martinez had been working toward. They successfully created a controlled, stable temporal anomaly in a laboratory setting. It was small, a bubble of displaced time no larger than a basketball, and it only lasted for 3.7 seconds before collapsing. But it proved the concept. Humanity could tear holes in time deliberately, controllably. The implications were staggering, not just for preventing future displacements, but for the possibility of deliberate time travel, of retrieving people lost to temporal anomalies, of potentially undoing the displacement of Flight 914's passengers. But Dr. Hayes, now recognized as the world's leading expert on temporal mechanics, urged caution. Creating a controlled anomaly is only the first step, she explained at the press conference announcing the breakthrough. Making it large enough and stable enough to transport people is exponentially more difficult. And even if we achieve that, the ethical and practical implications are enormous. Do we have the right to alter someone's timeline? To potentially create paradoxes? To risk the stability of causality itself? Michael watched the press conference from his living room, now a comfortable space filled with photos spanning two timelines, Janet as a young woman and as an elderly one, his children as kids and as middle-aged adults, his grandchildren at various ages, his colleagues from 1971 and his friends from 2015. Would he use controlled temporal displacement to return to 1971 if it became possible? The answer was still no, because the man who'd left Miami in 1971 wasn't the man sitting in this apartment in 2025. That man had been displaced, transformed, forced to adapt to an impossible situation. He'd lost things that could never be recovered. Years with his wife, the chance to raise his children, the continuity of a normal life. But he'd also gained things he'd never expected. A second chance, a unique perspective spanning decades, the satisfaction of helping others avoid his fate, the privilege of knowing his grandchildren not as an old man but as someone young enough to relate to them. He'd lived a life that shouldn't have been possible, and in doing so, he'd become something more than he might have been if that routine flight had simply landed in Dallas as scheduled. 3 years later, on September 16, 2028, exactly 57 years after Flight 914 departed Miami, Michael stood in the research facility's main laboratory. Dr. Hayes had invited him to witness the culmination of decades of work. Before him, suspended in a cradle of electromagnetic fields and exotic energy patterns, was a temporal anomaly large enough to walk through, stable, controlled, programmable to displace matter forward or backward through time by precise amounts. "We can send someone back now," Dr. Hayes told him, her voice filled with awe at what they'd achieved. "Not far, maybe a year, 2 at most, but it works. In theory, we could displace you backward to any point between 1971 and now. You could return to the day after you disappeared. You could live those years again." Michael stared at the shimmering portal, this impossible door between moments. He thought of Janet, young and alive in 1971, not knowing yet that her husband was about to vanish for 44 years. He thought of his children, young and needing their father. He thought of the life he'd missed. "I'm not going," he said firmly. Dr. Hayes nodded. She'd expected this answer. "Why not?" "Because I'm not that man anymore. The Michael Harrington who boarded Flight 914 in 1971 doesn't exist anymore. He was replaced by this version, the one who survived temporal displacement, who learned to live in a future he never expected to see, who found new purpose and meaning in an impossible situation. If I go back, I'd be imposing this version of me on a timeline that doesn't need him. The original Michael lived through 1971 to 2015 and died before I arrived. That timeline is complete. This timeline is where I belong now. No regrets?" Michael smiled. "Thousands of regrets, but also thousands of blessings I never expected. My grandchildren know me. I got to see Janet one more time before she died. I helped develop technology that will prevent others from experiencing what we went through. I became part of something larger than myself. If I went back, I'd lose all that. Dr. Hayes deactivated the anomaly, and it collapsed into nothing, the laboratory returning to normal space-time. For what it's worth, I think you made the right choice. Some of the other passengers asked about using it, Thomas Reed especially. But like you said, we're not the same people we were in 1971. We're the people who survived the impossible. That means something. Over the following years, a few of the Flight 914 passengers did choose to use controlled temporal displacement. Thomas Reed returned to 1971, unable to adapt any longer to the modern world. He arrived 2 days after his original departure, lived his life again with memories of the future, and, according to the carefully monitored timeline, led a relatively quiet existence, never revealing what had happened to him. But most chose to stay. They'd built lives in this timeline, found their places in this world. They gathered annually at the memorial, fewer each year as age and health took their inevitable toll, but those who remained formed a bond that transcended normal friendship. They were the people out of time, the impossible survivors, forever connected by their shared experience of being displaced from their own history. Michael continued his work at the flight school, training new pilots and occasionally consulting for the Temporal Displacement Research Facility. He watched his grandchildren grow up, get married, have children of their own, great-grandchildren who would never have existed if he'd returned to 1971. He grew old slowly, his internal biological clock still thinking less time had passed than the calendar insisted, but eventually age caught up with him as it does everyone. On his 75th birthday, chronologically only 33 years after he'd departed Miami in 1971, but 75 years since his actual birth, his family threw him a party. Daniel and Lisa were there, now elderly themselves. His grandchildren brought their children. Dr. Hayes attended, now retired but still consulting on temporal mechanics projects. A few other Flight 914 survivors came, those still alive and able to travel. "You did good, Captain," Dr. Hayes told him during a quiet moment. "You survived the impossible and you helped others do the same. You adapted. You thrived. You proved that even when time itself betrays us, humanity can endure." Michael looked around at the people gathered to celebrate him. Family members from 2 timelines, friends from 3 different decades, colleagues spanning impossible years. This was his life now, strange and complicated and precious. "I flew through a hole in time," he said. "I was supposed to be gone forever. Instead, I'm here, surrounded by people I love, having lived a life I never could have imagined. I think I'm the luckiest man in any timeline." That night, after everyone had left, Michael sat alone in his apartment. The city lights of Dallas-Fort Worth glittered outside his window, this future city that had become his home. On his television, a news report discussed the latest advances in temporal mechanics, talk of deliberate time travel becoming commercially available within a decade, of temporal tourism, of humanity finally mastering the 4th dimension. He thought about the young pilot who'd taken off from Miami on a clear September morning in 1971, expecting nothing more than a routine flight to Dallas. That man had been prepared for turbulence, maybe equipment failures, perhaps even an emergency landing, but not for time itself to tear open and swallow him whole, to spit him out 44 years in the future. That man would have been terrified, lost, unable to cope with displacement from everything he knew. But Michael wasn't that man anymore. He was the man who'd survived that displacement, who'd adapted and grown, who'd found meaning in the impossible and built a life in the ruins of his shattered timeline. The flight had departed Miami in 1971 and reappeared over Texas in 2015 with no explanation. But in the decades since, explanations had been found. Science had caught up with the impossible. Humanity had learned to tear holes in time deliberately, to control what had once been a terrifying natural phenomenon. And 60 displaced souls had learned to live in a world they were never supposed to see, to find purpose in a timeline that wasn't their own, to prove that even when everything is lost, survival is possible, growth is possible, life is possible. Michael turned off the television and went to bed. This impossible man in this impossible future, at peace with the choices he'd made and the timeline he'd claimed as his own. Tomorrow he'd wake up and live another day in a world that was 57 years removed from his birth time. But it would be his day, his world, his life. The plane had taken him forward through time, but he'd traveled even further on his own, not through space or time, but through acceptance and adaptation, and the recognition that sometimes the greatest journeys are the ones we never planned to take. He'd departed one world and arrived in another, and in doing so, he discovered that home isn't a place or a time. It's wherever you build it, whatever the circumstances, however impossible the journey that brought you there. The flight that departed Miami in 1971 had finally completed its journey, not to Dallas, not to any physical destination, but to a place of understanding and acceptance. Michael Harrington had finally landed, and he was home.